The morning sun cast long shadows across the empty downtown loft as Sarah Chen stood at the floor-to-ceiling windows, watching the city pulse with its familiar rhythm below. She had lived in this converted warehouse space for 8 years, through the rise of artisanal coffee shops on every corner, the transformation of abandoned factories into tech hubs, and the steady climb of rent that now consumed nearly half her income. Her phone buzzed with another email from her landlord, a rent increase notice, the third in 2 years. This time, it wasn't just a few $100s. It was a jump that would push her monthly payment beyond what she could reasonably afford, even with her stable marketing job at a mid-sized firm. She set the phone down and looked around at the exposed brick walls, the industrial pipes running across the ceiling, the open kitchen where she'd hosted countless dinner parties. This wasn't just an apartment. It was supposed to be her stake in urban life, her connection to the energy and opportunity that cities promised. Across town, Marcus and Jennifer Thompson sat at their kitchen table in their cramped 2-bedroom apartment, surrounded by papers and spreadsheets. Their daughter Emma's toys were scattered across the living room floor, and through the thin walls, they could hear their neighbor's television blaring. Jennifer was 6 months pregnant with their second child, and the reality of their situation had become impossible to ignore. The apartment that had seemed perfect for a young couple now felt suffocating. There was no yard for Emma to play in, no quiet space for the baby's nursery, and the local elementary school had class sizes that made them wince. Marcus pulled up a real estate listing on his laptop, a 4-bedroom house in Riverside Heights, a suburb 40 minutes outside the city. The mortgage payment would actually be less than their current rent, and the house came with a backyard, a 2-car garage, and access to schools that regularly sent students to top universities. Jennifer looked at the photos, her initial skepticism giving way to something she hadn't expected: hope. The phenomenon they were experiencing wasn't unique to them. Across America, a massive demographic shift was underway, reversing decades of urban revitalization and young professional migration to city centers. The suburban migration had begun quietly, almost imperceptibly, but by 2025 it had become one of the most significant population movements of the early 21st century. Families, young professionals, retirees, and even the creative class that had once been the vanguard of urban renewal were packing up and heading to the suburbs in numbers not seen since the 1950s. But this wasn't a simple repeat of white flight or post-war suburban expansion. This was different, driven by a complex web of economic pressures, technological changes, shifting values, and the lingering CTs of a global pandemic that had fundamentally altered how people thought about space, community, and the meaning of home. Dr. Patricia Alvarez had spent 20 years studying urban development patterns at Columbia University, and even she found herself surprised by the speed and scale of the shift. In her office overlooking Morningside Heights, she examined the latest census data, with a mixture of academic fascination and personal concern. The numbers told a story that contradicted decades of conventional wisdom about American settlement patterns. Cities that had experienced explosive growth in the 2000s and 2010s were now seeing their populations stabilize or even decline. Meanwhile, suburbs, particularly inner-ring suburbs with good transit connections and established infrastructure, were booming. But what made this migration particularly interesting was its composition. These weren't just families with children seeking good schools and safe streets. These were millennials in their 30s and 40s, Generation Z workers who had never experienced the traditional suburban lifestyle, and even older urban dwellers who had spent their entire adult lives championing dense, walkable neighborhoods. The economic factors driving the migration were undeniable and, for many, overwhelming. Urban housing costs had reached levels that seemed disconnected from economic reality. In cities like San Francisco, New York, Boston, and Seattle, the median home price had soared past $1 million. Even renting had become untenable for middle-class families. A 2-bedroom apartment in a decent urban neighborhood could easily cost $3,000 to $5,000 per month, sometimes more. For the same monthly payment, or often less, families could own a spacious home in the suburbs with multiple bedrooms, a yard, and significantly lower property taxes. The math was simple, and for many households, it was decisive. The premium for urban living, once justified by proximity to jobs, cultural amenities, and vibrant street life, had grown so large that it no longer made financial sense for anyone but the wealthy or those willing to sacrifice other financial goals. But economics alone didn't explain the migration. Technology had fundamentally altered the equation of where people needed to live. The rapid adoption of remote work, accelerated dramatically by the COVID-19 pandemic, had severed the physical connection between many workers and their employers. Companies that had once insisted on 5 days a week in the office now offered hybrid arrangements or fully remote positions. Tech workers who had tolerated San Francisco's crushing housing costs because their jobs were in Silicon Valley suddenly realized they could work from anywhere with a reliable internet connection. The same was true for accountants, lawyers, consultants, designers, and countless other professionals whose jobs had been tied to office buildings in downtown business districts. When this requirement to commute 5 days a week disappeared, the calculus of where to live changed entirely. Why pay urban prices for urban proximity when proximity no longer mattered? Sarah Chen had experienced this transformation firsthand. Her marketing firm had initially resisted remote work, insisting that creativity and collaboration required face-to-face interaction. But when the pandemic forced everyone home, something unexpected happened. Productivity didn't collapse. In fact, many teams found they could work more efficiently without the constant interruptions of an open office plan. After 2 years of remote work, the company announced a permanent hybrid policy. Employees would be required to come to the office just 2 days per week. For Sarah, this changed everything. She no longer needed to live 10 minutes from downtown. She could live 30 or 40 minutes away and still have a shorter commute than many of her suburban colleagues had endured in the old 5-day office model. The city apartment that had once been a necessity was now simply a choice, an expensive choice that was becoming harder to justify. The quality of life considerations were equally powerful. Marcus and Jennifer Thompson weren't alone in feeling squeezed by urban living with children. Cities had always been challenging for families, but the challenges had intensified. Urban schools, particularly public schools, often struggled with overcrowding, underfunding, and achievement gaps that troubled parents. Private schools offered an alternative, but at costs that could exceed college tuition. Meanwhile, suburban school districts marketed themselves aggressively, touting their test scores, AP offerings, sports facilities, and college acceptance rates. For parents worried about giving their children every advantage, the choice seemed clear. Beyond education, there was the simple matter of space. Urban apartments, even expensive ones, rarely offered the room that growing families needed. There was nowhere for children to play outside without supervision, no basement for a playroom, no garage for storage, no quiet home office where parents could work during remote days. The safety concerns that had driven earlier waves of suburban migration remained relevant, though the nature of those concerns had evolved. Urban crime rates had fluctuated over the decades, but recent upticks in property crime, car break-ins, and visible homelessness had made many urbanites feel less secure. Jennifer Thompson had never forgotten the night someone broke into their car, parked right outside their apartment, smashing the window for a bag containing nothing but gym clothes. The car seat in the back, evidence of their young daughter, had made the violation feel more personal and threatening. In the suburbs, they told themselves this wouldn't happen. Whether this belief was accurate or simply a comforting fiction, it was powerful enough to motivate action. Gated communities, neighborhood watch PR, programs, and lower population density all contributed to a perception of safety that urban areas struggled to match. Yet the suburban migration wasn't a simple abandonment of urban values. Many of those leaving cities weren't rejecting urbanism entirely. They were seeking what researchers began calling suburban urbanism, communities that combined suburban space and affordability with urban amenities and walkability. The most successful suburbs in attracting urban migrants were those that had invested in creating downtown districts with restaurants, shops, and entertainment venues. They built multi-use trails for biking and walking. They preserved or created town centers where residents could gather. They attracted coffee shops, bookstores, and farmers markets, the very amenities that had made urban neighborhoods appealing. These weren't the car-dependent subdivisions of the 1960s. These were communities consciously designed to capture some of what made cities attractive while avoiding what made them difficult. Riverside Heights, the suburb Marcus and Jennifer were considering, exemplified this new suburban model. Its downtown area featured a renovated main street with locally owned restaurants, a craft brewery, a yoga studio, and a park with a weekly farmers market. The town had invested millions in a trail system connecting residential neighborhoods to schools and commercial areas. There was even a small arts center that hosted concerts and theater productions. Real estate agents selling homes in Riverside Heights didn't pitch it as an escape from urban culture. They pitched it as access to urban culture without urban costs and hassles. You could walk to dinner and a movie, they said, then walk home to a house with a yard where your kids could play. It was the best of both worlds, they promised, and for many buyers, the promise was convincing. The migration was also driven by a changing relationship with nature and outdoor space. The pandemic had reminded people how important access to the outdoors was for physical and mental health. Urban parks, wonderful as they were, had become crowded and sometimes felt inadequate. People wanted their own private outdoor spaces. They wanted gardens where they could grow vegetables. They wanted yards where their children and dogs could run freely. They wanted to see stars at night and hear birds in the morning. These weren't luxuries, they had become necessities. Suburbs, particularly those in less densely developed regions, offered this access to nature as a fundamental feature rather than a rare amenity. The quarter-acre lot that had once seemed like wasteful sprawl now looked like a sanctuary, a place to breathe and decompress away from urban intensity. Financial considerations extended beyond housing costs. Suburban living often meant lower overall cost of living. Property taxes, while variable, were frequently lower than in cities. Car insurance was cheaper. There were fewer temptations to spend money on restaurants, bars, and entertainment, because these were less ubiquitous. Families found they could save more, invest more, and feel less financial stress. For young professionals trying to build wealth, buy their first home, or save for retirement, the suburban financial advantage was compelling. The extra $1,000 or $2,000 per month that suburban living could save wasn't trivial. Over a decade, it could mean the difference between financial security and perpetual struggle. When combined with the opportunity to build equity through homeownership, rather than enriching landlords through rent, the economic argument for suburban migration became overwhelming. But the migration wasn't without its critics and complications. Urbanists warned that the suburban exodus could undermine decades of progress in creating sustainable, walkable cities. They pointed out that suburban living typically meant more driving, more carbon emissions, and more environmental impact. The CARDEP, indent lifestyle of traditional suburbs contributed to climate change, air pollution, and sedentary health problems. Dense urban living, they argued, was more ecologically responsible and should be encouraged through policy and planning. As people left cities, these critics warned, the urban infrastructure that served them, public transit, cultural institutions, small businesses, would suffer. Cities might enter a death spiral of declining population, reduced tax revenue, deteriorating services, and further population loss. The vibrancy and diversity that made cities special could be lost. There were also concerns about what the migration meant for social and economic equality. Those leaving cities were disproportionately white, affluent, and educated. They had the resources and flexibility to choose where they lived. Those remaining in cities were more likely to be poor, people of color, and trapped by circumstances beyond their control. The suburban migration risked creating or exacerbating a two-tiered society, comfortable suburban enclaves for the prosperous and struggling cities for those left behind. This pattern echoed troubling historical precedents, from white flight in the 1960s to the abandonment of Rust Belt cities in later decades. Critics worried that instead of addressing urban problems, affordable housing, school quality, public safety, infrastructure, the solution had become simply leaving, which only made those problems worse for those who remained. Sarah Chen wrestled with these concerns as she considered her own potential move. She had always thought of herself as committed to urban living, to the diversity and energy and possibility that cities represented. Leaving felt like a betrayal of those values, an admission that the urban experiment had failed. Yet when she visited her friends who had already moved to suburbs, she couldn't deny what she saw. They seemed happier, less stressed, more financially stable. Their children played in yards and rode e-bikes on quiet streets. They had home offices, guest rooms, and garage workshops. They weren't living in cultural deserts. They had found or created communities that reflected their values. They went to farmers markets, supported local businesses, volunteered at libraries and schools. They hadn't abandoned progressive politics or environmental consciousness. They had simply decided that they could live those values better in a different setting. The pandemic had been the catalyst that transformed suburban migration from a steady trend into a flood. When COVID-19 forced millions of Americans to work from home, live their entire lives within their residences, and limit outside contact, the limitations of urban apartments became painfully clear. People working from cramped one-bedroom apartments trying to take Zoom calls while roommates moved about, with no outdoor space for relief, began to question their choices. The density that had made cities exciting now made them dangerous, as the virus spread more easily in crowded environments. Public transportation, once a virtue of urban living, became a risk to avoid. The restaurants, bars, museums, and theaters that justified paying urban prices all closed. What were city dwellers paying for? The premium for urban living evaporated when urban life itself became impossible. As lockdowns eased and life slowly returned to something resembling normalcy, many of those who had fled cities during the worst of the pandemic didn't return. They had discovered that suburban or even rural living suited them. They had found communities, established routines, and realized they didn't miss the city as much as they had expected. Their employers, having survived months or years of remote work, were no longer insisting on office returns. The window of opportunity was open, and millions of people climbed through it. Real estate markets in suburbs and small cities boomed. Bidding wars erupted over houses in towns that had previously gelled to attract residents. Remote workers from expensive coastal cities brought their large city salaries to small-town housing markets, driving up prices and sometimes displacing locals who suddenly couldn't afford to live in their own communities. Marcus and Jennifer Thompson made their decision on a cool Saturday morning, after touring the house in Riverside Heights for the third time. Jennifer stood in what would be Emma's bedroom, imagining how they would decorate it, while Marcus examined the backyard, already planning where he would build a play structure. The house wasn't perfect. It was older than they had hoped, and it would need updates. The commute to the city, even just twice a week, would be longer than they were used to. They would need to buy a second car. But when they looked at each other, they both knew the life they wanted, the life they could afford, the life that made sense for their growing family. It was here, not in the city they had once loved. They made an O for that afternoon, slightly above asking price but less than they had feared they would need to bid. A week later, it was accepted. They would be suburban homeowners. The industries and businesses that had thrived on urban density began to adapt or struggle. Downtown restaurants found their lunch crowds diminished as office workers stayed home or moved away. Retailers in urban shopping districts watched foot traffic decline. Landlords of office buildings faced rising vacancy rates as companies downsized their physical footprints or abandoned offices entirely. The commercial real estate sector, which had bet billions on the continued growth of urban business districts, faced a reckoning. Some buildings were converted to residential use, though the economics of such conversions were challenging. Others sat partially empty, their owners hoping that a full return to office work would eventually materialize. That hope, for many, would prove futile. The transformation of work was not temporary. It was permanent, and it was remaking the urban landscape. Cities fought back, attempting to retain residents and attract new ones through various strategies. Some offered tax incentives for first-time homebuyers or created programs to increase affordable housing. Others invested in parks, playgrounds, and family-friendly amenities to compete with suburban offerings. A few pioneering cities experimented with radical solutions, allowing the conversion of commercial zones to residential, relaxing zoning restrictions to enable more housing construction, or even providing subsidies for families with children. New York City launched a campaign celebrating urban life and highlighting the unique advantages of city living, cultural diversity, walking accessibility, and the serendipitous encounters that cities enabled. Some of these efforts showed promise. Cities with good transit, strong job markets, and genuine commitments to affordability managed to stabilize their populations. But others continued to hemorrhage residents, particularly those in regions where suburban alternatives were abundant and affordable. The political implications of suburban migration were profound and far-reaching. Suburbs had traditionally been politically competitive, swinging between Democratic and Republican candidates depending on economic conditions and national mood. But the new suburban migrants were different from traditional suburbanites. Many were younger, more diverse, and more progressive than previous generations of suburban residents. They brought urban political sensibilities to communities that had been conservative strongholds. In some regions, this influx turned purple suburbs blue, shifting the political balance of entire states. School board meetings in formerly quiet suburban towns became heated debates over curriculum, diversity initiatives, and funding priorities. Zoning board hearings, once sparsely attended, now drew crowds of engaged residents with strong opinion about development, density, and community character. The suburbs were becoming more politically dynamic, more contested, and more important to national political outcomes. Sarah Chen finally made her move on a rainy Tuesday in March. The movers had emptied her loft by noon, and she drove out to her new rental house in Brookfield, a suburb 30 miles from downtown. It wasn't a purchase. She wasn't ready for that commitment yet. But it was a trial, a chance to see if suburban life suited her. The house was twice the size of her old apartment, with 3 bedrooms, a small yard, and a garage. Her rent was actually less than what she had been paying downtown. As she walked through the empty rooms, part of her felt loss. She was leaving behind a chapter of her life, an identity she had cultivated. But another part felt relief and possibility. She could breathe here. She could save money. She could figure out what came next without the constant financial pressure that had defined her urban years. That evening, she walked to the small downtown area, just 10 minutes from her house, and found a wine bar that wouldn't have been out of place in her old neighborhood. Perhaps, she thought, this wouldn't be such a dramatic change after all. The impact on urban schools was particularly significant and troubling. As families with children left cities, urban school districts saw enrollment declines. Fewer students meant reduced state funding, which led to budget cuts, program eliminations, and sometimes school closures. The families who remained, often those with fewer resources and options, found their children attending increasingly underfunded and struggling schools. The achievement gaps that had always existed in urban education widened. Some cities, recognizing the crisis, tried to improve their schools to compete with suburban districts, investing in facilities, reducing class sizes, and expanding programs. Charter schools and specialized academies proliferated, offering alternatives to traditional public schools. But these reforms were expensive and took time, and in the meantime, families continued to leave. The loss of middle-class families from urban schools didn't just affect budgets, it affected the social and economic diversity that many educators believed was crucial to school success. The environmental consequences of suburban migration generated intense debate. Critics pointed to increased vehicle miles traveled, greater per capita energy consumption in larger homes, and the conversion of open space and farmland to housing developments. The carbon footprint of suburban living was undeniably larger than urban living, particularly in traditional car-dependent suburbs. But defenders of the migration argued that the picture was more complex. Many new suburban residents worked remotely, eliminating commutes entirely or reducing them dramatically. Modern suburban homes were often more energy efficient than older urban apartments. Electric vehicles air reducing the climate impact of driving. And some suburbs were genuinely investing in alternative transportation, building bike paths, improving bus service, and creating walkable town centers. The environmental impact wasn't inevitable. It depended on how suburbs were designed and how residents chose to live. The challenge was ensuring that suburban growth happened in smart, sustainable ways, rather than repeating the sprawl mistakes of the past. Dr. Patricia Alvarez published a paper in the Journal of Urban Studies that attempted to make sense of the migration and predict its long-term effects. She argued that what America was witnessing wasn't the death of cities, but their transformation. Cities, she suggested, would become more specialized, focusing on their unique strengths, as centers of innovation, culture, education, and industries that truly required dense clustering. They would house more young people in the early stages of their careers, more wealthy individuals who could afford urban premiums, and more poor populations who lacked alternatives. The middle class, families, professionals in the middle stages of their careers, those seeking value and space, would increasingly choose suburbs. This wasn't necessarily bad, Alvarez argued, if both cities and suburbs adapted appropriately. Cities needed to become more affordable and family-friendly, Suburbs needed to become more sustainable and equitable. The future American landscape would be more complex than the simple urban-suburban dichotomy suggested, with a spectrum of communities offering different combinations of density, affordability, amenities, and lifestyles. Marcus and Jennifer Thompson moved into their Riverside Heights home on a bright Saturday in May. Friends from the city came to help, and there was a bittersweet quality to the day. Their urban friends were happy for them but also mourning the loss of proximity. Weekend brunches would be less frequent. Spontaneous gatherings would be harder to arrange. Their circle would inevitably shrink or transform. But as the day progressed and their friends explored the house and yard, Jennifer noticed something. Several of them seemed wistful, even envious. One friend asked detailed questions about the mortgage, the school district, and the commute. Another spent a long time in the backyard, watching Emma play on the grass, and quietly mentioned that she and her partner had been talking about leaving the city too. The migration wasn't something happening to other people. It was happening to them, to their community, to their generation. By evening, as they sat on their new back deck, Marcus and Jennifer felt something they hadn't expected. They felt like pioneers, part of a larger movement reshaping American life. The cultural narrative around the suburban migration evolved as it progressed. Initially, media coverage often portrayed it as a retreat, a failure of urban idealism, or even a betrayal of progressive values. Headlines asked, cities were dying, if remote work was destroying downtown, if Americans had given up on density and diversity. But over time, a different narrative emerged. Journalists profiled the suburbs that were thriving by adapting to new residents' expectations. They wrote about former urbanites creating community gardens, starting local businesses, and bringing urban sophistication to suburban settings. They highlighted suburban towns that were becoming more diverse, more culturally vibrant, and more politically engaged. The story became less about what people were leaving behind and more about what they were building. The suburbs weren't cultural wastelands. They were being remade by people who valued culture, community, and quality of life, but needed more space and affordability than cities could provide. Economic researchers began studying the wealth-building implications of the migration. For many middle-class families, buying a suburban home represented their single best opportunity to build wealth. Homeownership, despite its risks and challenges, remained one of the most reliable paths to financial security in America. Urban renters, no matter how much they earned, were not building equity. They were paying landlords, and as rents rose, they were paying more and more for the same space. Suburban homeowners, even accounting for mortgages, property taxes, and maintenance, were building equity with every payment. Over 20 or 30 years, that equity could become substantial, funding retirement, helping children with college, or providing a financial cushion for emergencies. For families who had felt financially stuck in expensive urban rental markets, the move to suburban home ownership was transformative. It changed their entire financial trajectory, creating possibilities that had seemed foreclosed. The technology sector, both as an industry and as a source of workers, played a central role in the migration. Tech companies had been among the first to embrace remote work, and tech workers were among the most mobile. A software engineer could write code from anywhere with an internet connection. A product manager could attend video conferences from a home office in the suburbs as easily as from a downtown office. As tech workers dispersed from Silicon Valley, Seattle, Austin, and Boston, they brought their skills, their salaries, and their expectations to communities across America. Some small cities and suburbs actively courted these workers, offering incentives, promoting their quality of life, and building co-working spaces. Tulsa, Oklahoma famously offered $10,000 to remote workers who relocated there. Other cities created programs to attract digital nomads and remote professionals. The competition for mobile talent was reshaping regional economic development strategies. Sarah Chen found her suburban experience more complex than she had anticipated. The space and affordability were wonderful, just as promised. She loved having a home office where she could close the door and focus. She enjoyed her small garden, where she grew tomatoes and herbs. She saved money and felt less financial stress, but she also felt isolated in ways she hadn't expected. Making friends was harder than in the city, where proximity and shared spaces naturally facilitated connection. Her suburban neighbors were friendly but busy with their own families and lives. The serendipitous encounters that had defined urban life running into friends at coffee shops, striking up conversations at bars, attending impromptu gatherings. Didn't happen here. She had to be intentional about social connection, scheduling everything in advance. It wasn't bad, exactly, but it was different, and sometimes she missed the effortless sociability of urban density. The retail landscape adapted to suburban migration in unexpected ways. Downtown shopping districts in thriving suburbs saw new investment and development. National chains followed the population, opening locations in suburban town centers. But more interestingly, independent businesses thrived. Former urbanites who moved to suburbs often opened the kinds of businesses they had loved in the city. Independent bookstores, specialty food shops, craft breweries, yoga studios, and artisanal coffee roasters. They brought urban commercial culture to suburban settings, creating pockets of sophistication and variety that challenged stereotypes about suburban commercial life. These businesses became community gathering places, serving the same social function that neighborhood spots had served in cities. They gave suburban downtowns vitality and character, making them destinations rather than just places people passed through on their way to somewhere else. The question of social capital and community cohesion arose as researchers examined the migration's effects. Cities, for all their challenges, forced interaction across lines of difference, rich and poor, different ethnicities and cultures, various political persuasions, all shared public spaces and couldn't entirely avoid each other. Suburbs, particularly affluent suburbs, risked becoming more homogeneous and segregated. When people could choose exactly where to live based on school districts, demographics, and political leanings, they often chose communities that mirrored themselves. This self-sorting could lead to decreased understanding across social divides and increased political polarization. Some suburban communities worked actively to maintain or create diversity through affordable housing requirements, inclusive programming, and welcoming initiatives. Others became increasingly uniform, with all the social and political implications that uniformity entailed. Marcus and Jenny, for Thompson's first year in Riverside Heights, confirmed their decision, but also challenged some assumptions. Emma thrived, with friends on the street and a backyard to play in. The new baby, a boy they named Leo, came home to a nursery instead of a corner of their bedroom. Jennifer's parents visited and could actually stay with them in the guest room. Marcus built the play structure he had imagined and felt pride in his home in a way he never had as a renter, but they also struggled with unexpected challenges. The commute, even twice a week, was draining. They missed the cultural options of the city, the museums, the theaters, the diverse restaurants. They felt disconnected from the political and social energy that had animated their urban years. They had to work harder to maintain relationships with city friends. The suburbs offered much, but they didn't offer everything, and the Thompsons found themselves negotiating what they had gained against what they had lost. The transformatio of downtown business districts forced cities to reimagine their purpose and identity. If offices were half empty and might never fill again, what should downtown be? Some cities embraced residential conversion, recognizing that thriving downtowns needed people living there, not just working there. They changed zoning laws, offered incentives for housing development, and tried to create 24/7 neighborhoods with shopping, dining, and entertainment supporting residential populations. Others leaned into tourism and culture, positioning downtowns as destinations for visitors and suburban residents, rather than daily workplace for commuters. A few cities experimented with radical ideas, pedestrian-only zones, massive new parks on former office sites, or even managed decline, accepting that their downtowns would be smaller and focusing resources on making them excellent rather than extensive. The most successful cities pursued multiple strategies simultaneously, creating diverse, resilient urban and cores that didn't depend on any single use or population. The school district dynamics that drove much suburban migration created a self-reinforcing cycle. As families moved to highly rated suburban districts, those districts received more resources through property taxes and had more parental involvement, which further improved performance. Meanwhile, urban districts that lost families saw declining resources and struggled more, which encouraged more families to leave. Breaking this cycle required significant intervention. Some states tried to equalize school funding to reduce disparities between wealthy and poor districts. Others created magnet programs or lottery systems to promote integration and opportunity. A few cities made dramatic improvements to specific schools and used those successes to market themselves to families. But systemic change was slow, and in the meantime, individual families made decisions based on immediate circumstances. The long-term solution to urban school challenges required political will, sustained investment and time, luxuries that families with school-aged children often didn't feel they had. Sarah Chen's suburban trial became permanent when her landlord offered to sell her the house. She had been there for 18 months and had gradually adjusted to suburban rhythms. She had joined a book club, started attending a local yoga studio, and made a few genuine friends. She had learned to drive more and accepted that social plans required more advanced coordination. When her landlord presented the opportunity to buy, Sarah ran the numbers and realized that owning would actually cost less monthly than renting. Once she factored in tax deductions and avoided annual rent increases, she was building equity instead of paying someone else's mortgage. The decision, which would have seemed unthinkable 2 years earlier, now seemed obvious. She bought the house, becoming a suburban homeowner at 34, joining the migration fully, and irreversibly. On closing day, she felt simultaneously like she was betraying her younger self and fulfilling her adult self's needs. Both feelings were true, and she was learning to live with that complexity. The political ramifications of suburban migration extended beyond simple partisan shifts. The new suburbanites brought different policy priorities. They cared about climate change and wanted their towns to invest in sustainability. They supported public education funding and library systems. They expected diversity and inclusion initiatives. They wanted local businesses, walkable downtowns, and preserved green spaces. In many communities, this led to conflicts with longer-term suburban residents who had chosen suburbs precisely to avoid urban politics and attitudes. School board meetings, zoning hearings, and town council sessions became battlegrounds over the future direction of suburban communities. Were they going to become extensions of urban progressive culture, or would they maintain traditional suburban conservative values? The answer varied by community, but everywhere, the influx of urban migrants was making suburbs more politically dynamic and contested. The pandemic's role in accelerating suburban migration couldn't be overstated, but it was important to recognize that the pandemic accelerated trends that were already underway. Even before COVID-19, urban housing costs were driving people away. Remote work was slowly increasing. Families were finding cities less accommodating. The pandemic didn't create these dynamics, it intensified them and removed barriers that had slowed the migration. Once people realized they could work from anywhere, once companies accepted remote work as viable, once the psychological connection between job and place was severed, the constraints that had kept people in expensive cities despite their frustrations disappeared. The pandemic was a catalyst, not a cause, and this distinction mattered for understanding whether the migration was temporary or permanent. All evidence suggested it was permanent, driven by fundamental economic and technological forces rather than pandemic-specific fears. The infrastructure challenges of suburban growth became increasingly apparent as migration accelerated. Roads designed for lower traffic volumes became congested. Schools built for stable populations had to expand quickly. Water and sewer systems needed upgrades. Parks and recreational facilities required investment. Suburban governments, often with smaller budgets and less experience managing rapid growth than cities, struggled to keep pace. Some handled it well, planning proactively and investing wisely. Others fell behind, creating quality-of-life problems that threatened to undermine the very advantages that had attracted new residents. Traffic congestion in particular emerged as a major concern. People had moved to suburbs partly to escape urban crowding and stress, but if suburban roads became as jammed as city streets, that advantage evaporated. Smart suburbs invested in alternative transportation, road improvements, and land use planning that reduced driving demand. Others simply watched traffic worsen and hoped it wouldn't drive people away. Marcus Thompson's twice-weekly commute to the city became a case study in the challenges and trade-offs of suburban life. The drive took anywhere from 45 minutes to 90 minutes, depending on traffic. He left early to avoid the worst congestion and worked late on his office days to miss the evening rush. It was exhausting, and there were days when he questioned whether the suburban house was worth it. But then he would come home to Emma playing in the backyard, to Leo taking his first steps across the living room, to Jennifer cooking in a kitchen with actual counter space, and the commute seemed like a small price to pay. He experimented with different routes, tried audiobooks and podcasts to make the drive more bearable and occasional. Y worked from a coffee shop near his office on commute days to reduce the total travel time. It wasn't ideal, but it was manageable, and it was the compromise that made everything else possible. The generational aspects of suburban migration revealed interesting patterns. Millennials, once considered the quintessentially urban generation, were leading the suburban exodus as they entered their 30s and 40s and started families. Generation Z, the cohort behind them, showed more mixed patterns. Some embraced urban life enthusiastically, seeing cities as centers of opportunity and culture. Others, having grown up during the pandemic and experienced remote learning and work, were less attached to physical place and more comfortable with digital connection. They might choose suburbs, small cities, or even rural areas based on affordability, lifestyle, and remote work opportunities. The oldest generations, baby boomers and older Gen X, showed different patterns. Some retired to suburbs or smaller cities to reduce living costs and be near grandchildren. Others stayed in cities, valuing walkability and cultural access as they aged. The migration wasn't uniform across ages, varied by life stage, values, and individual circumstances. The question of what happened to the urban housing that migrants vacated became significant. In some cities, vacated apartments were quickly filled by new arrivals, immigrants, young people starting careers, students. The turnover was high but continuous. In other cities, particularly smaller ones or those with fewer economic opportunities, vacated units stayed empty. Landlords reduced rents to attract tenants, which made housing more affordable for those remaining but also reduced property values and tax revenues. Some buildings were converted to other uses or simply abandoned. The worst-case scenario, which a few cities experienced, was a self-reinforcing decline. People left, buildings emptied, property values fell, tax revenues declined, services degraded, more people left. Preventing this spiral required active intervention, creative policies, and often significant public investment. The cities that managed it successfully became case studies. Those that didn't became cautionary tales. Sarah Chen's changing relationship with the city she had left illustrated the complex emotions many suburban migrants felt. She still visited regularly, meeting friends for dinners, attending concerts, visiting museums. In some ways, she appreciated the city more now that she didn't live there. She enjoyed urban experiences without the stress of urban costs and constraints. She could have the best of both worlds, suburban home life and urban cultural access. But she also felt increasingly like a visitor, and